Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is Cheryl Manning calling in from TrainingPros, and I wanted to be able to welcome you to the Learning Views webinar hosted by TrainingPros and the University of Harrisburg with their Advanced Instructional Design program. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's subject is about mindfulness, and we're very excited about this topic, especially the timeliness of this topic, and we're really grateful for Brenda for joining in and being able to help us to really understand the practices behind mindfulness, why it matters in today's world, and then simple practices that we can incorporate into our work days immediately. So I wanted to be able to just say a few things about the webinar and about these kinds of webinars to set a context for you, introduce you to the topic, and introduce you to Brenda. But really the majority of our time today is really going to be spent with Brenda as she breaks down the principles and practices of mindfulness and how to incorporate that. So as I mentioned, I'm Cheryl Manning, and I'm a relationship manager with TrainingPros. I work with clients around the Southeast predominantly, and like many of my peers, I started as an instructional design practitioner in the field. So I ran large instructional design projects for Accenture, creating custom programs for their IT consultants. I then had a long period of time where I was an account executive in the soft skills training consulting business, and I've been with TrainingPros for over 8 years. And very simply, what we do is we help clients who, like yourselves, are very busy and find themselves with more projects than they have people. And we know that that can be stressful as you look at deadlines that you feel stressed to meet, or as you look for some gaps in your current team with expertise that you need to be able to provide for something new or something that is a stretch. We know that that can be time-consuming and stressful, and so we're really there to be able to provide that kind of help for you in a way that makes it easy for you. So we're there to be able to provide, to understand what you need, to provide these kinds of services, and to provide you with the kind of consultants who can help you to be able to start your projects with confidence. We do that in a variety of areas. This slide shows you some of the common ways that we help, whether that's instructional design or e-learning development or technical communication or change management or facilitation. This workshop today is part of our series of Learning Views, and we do it in partnership with Harrisburg University. We jointly believe that it's important to be able to give back to our community, and so this is part of that service to you. We look for what are emerging trends within the business, what are our clients worried about, what are they focused on, what are they trying to do, and that really guides us in understanding how to be able to be helpful to you. Today's topic on mindfulness actually was something that Brenda and I planned a year ago. And in 2019, the statistics were a little sobering, and this was, of course, prior to our COVID-19 situation that we find ourselves in today. So what we had heard from leaders was that over 45% said that stress was the predominant emotion that they felt in their lives. And over 51% of them felt that at the end of the day, they were both physically and emotionally drained. And now we find ourselves in COVID-19, and we find ourselves looking for the new normal. And this kind of stress is predominant. And we find ourselves searching for ways to be able to help us, help our teams, and help our organizations to stay focused and productive. So prior to this, organizations like Google, Nike, Apple had turned to the practices of mindfulness as a way of gaining that kind of focus, that kind of clarity, that kind of productivity. And so we're very excited to have Brenda really work with us today to really break that down into the science and to how it works, why it matters, and how we can take these practices today and help that to be a part of our lives going forward and for those that work with us and that surround us. So let me take a moment just to brag on Brenda for a moment before we get started. So Brenda is a fabulous consultant. She's someone who has a deep understanding and experience set, especially within leadership development. She, in her corporate career, she worked to be able to establish those capabilities and those practices for organizations like Tiffany's and Foot Locker. As a consultant, she's expanded that to be able to work with individuals, to work with teams, and to work with organizations to strengthen these skills. She's been practicing mindfulness herself for a long time. However, she's recently getting certified in the practice. She will be a mindful workplace facilitator. And so we're excited and we're blessed to have her join us today and help us to understand this practice and how it can be helpful to each of us. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Brenda.
Hello. Thank you, Cheryl, for that introduction, and it's so good to be with you today. When I first talked with Cheryl and TrainingPros about doing this webinar, the virus wasn't even on our radar, and it's amazing how quickly our world has changed just in 2 months, and how we're all adapting to a new normal. I was reminded last week of something one of my mentors said. She said, "Life is our curriculum, and the syllabus is subject to change at any moment." Well, I think it's safe to say that our syllabus has completely changed and will continue to. So I feel honored to be able to share this topic today and feel it couldn't come at a better time. So just a little bit of background about how I came to be an advocate for mindful leadership. I've been fascinated by and practicing mindfulness for about 10 years now. And I'd say it's just within the past 3 to 5 that I've seen this huge wave of acceptance. I joke that I used to be a closet meditator, and I've since learned I'm not the only one. But when I worked in corporate, I wasn't ashamed to share my mindfulness practice in any way, but I also didn't think it would help me, if that makes sense. I didn't tell my coworkers or my boss. I didn't want anyone to think I was weak or unable to make tough decisions, or God forbid they thought I was woo-woo, if you've heard that term before. And the funny thing is, the more I practiced mindfulness, the more I felt like it was my secret weapon that helped me cope with stresses on and off the job. So fast forward, I'm a leadership coach and a trainer, and I've had my business now for about a little over 3 years. And I never expected to be sharing this work with others, but I started to see a real need. Many of my clients expressed interest in learning more about mindfulness and meditation, but they weren't sure where to start. And so over time, I narrowed down what I consider essential and most relevant for busy leaders today. And I started sharing 6 what I call anchor practices that provide structure and an entry point for those interested in developing an ongoing practice. So today I'll be sharing with you highlights from a longer program where we explore these anchor practices, and afterwards, after our webinar today, there'll be a summary handout so you can learn more about them. And if you have any questions, Justin is going to be monitoring the chat box, and so we'll make sure to leave time for questions. So thank you for that, Justin. All right. So I don't know about you, but humor is one of the things that's definitely helping me get through this crisis. And I thoroughly appreciate the many online cartoons and jokes out there right now. They really help to cut the tension. So I think I already saw through the chat box, where some of you are calling in from. If you haven't done so yet, I'd love to know, who's calling in from where, and maybe where you're socially distancing yourself from. Go ahead and add that to the chat if you haven't already. Or maybe, which room are you in your socially distanced office. I'll give you just a second to do that. And I see there's people from Orlando, Costa Rica, Chicago. Oh, wonderful. Massachusetts in my living room. Hello, Ohio. Long Island, New York, great. Boston. Great. the guest room overlooking the lawn in Georgia. Commuted to the dining room table today. Yes. Great. All right, this is great. Please continue to add if you haven't already. I'd love to know, where you're calling in from. And so what you're looking at now is the rarely seen follow-up slide to socially distanced Waldo. People always ask, where is he? But no one ever bothers to ask, how is Waldo? So it's probably safe to say we're all experiencing some level of what I call corona fatigue. And before we dive into our material, I'd like to just do a quick temperature check and see how we're feeling right now. So this is a self-survey I typically give out at the beginning of a mindful leadership workshop. And the opening usually says, during an average work week. Well, there's no average right now. There's no average, the last 2 months. So I've modified it to say, during this crisis. So take a look at this list and think to yourself, which of these have you been feeling? And which ones maybe have you been feeling more intensely than others? Are there any here that you'd rate a full-on 10? While maybe some others are a little lower, say a 5 or less? And if you're open to it, I'd encourage you to share in the chat. What are 1 or 2 that bubble up to the surface for you lately? 1 or 2 maybe that you'd rate higher than the others. Unable to concentrate, distractibility, worrying about the future. This is the shift that I'm seeing as well. Stressed, anxious, and overwhelmed probably would have been the top of the list for many just 2 months ago, and I feel like there's a shift. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Fearing the unknown. The brain hates the unknown. And that is what we're working with right now. The brain loves to plan and predict. Yeah, I think the 2 on the bottom, fearing the unknown and worrying about the future, those may have been, say, lower on my list up until recently, and I've noticed them surfacing to the top. Yeah. Distractibility. Yeah. Let's just take the top one, distracted or unable to concentrate. I've been doing this work for a while, but believe me, there is always room for self-improvement. During the past month, I've gotten sort of out of the habit of monotasking or focusing my attention on one thing or one person at a time. And I found that I've gotten easily distracted by what feels like this endless blend of home and work activities. Maybe you can relate to that as well. So just a quick story. I think it's kind of funny. My husband and I were watching the show Elementary recently. And if you haven't seen it, it's kind of like a modern day Sherlock Holmes. And we were about halfway through an episode. And I must have picked up my phone to look at a text or an update. And sadly, I don't even remember doing it. And when I looked back to the TV, I realized I have no idea what is going on in the show. And I say to my husband, wait, I'm so confused. Both characters are dead now? I need you to rewind. And he just laughed and said, no, if you missed all that, I'm going to need to go back to the beginning. So this is just a silly example of how easy it is to get distracted, especially when we're working from home. But if you can anyway relate, you can help me feel better and put a yes in the chat box if that's ever happened to you. Yes, all right, thank you. But it is interesting through this, this crisis, how it's surfacing these different emotional states in us, maybe causing us to feel emotions that we might not have felt before. And it's important to acknowledge and name these when we can. It's the idea of name it so you can tame it. And mindfulness can be a great tool to help us through difficult emotions, but it's not a cure. What it can do is help us mitigate the intensity of our emotions and help us self-regulate so those emotions are not in the driver's seat. All right. So here's our official agenda today. I've been a Florida resident now for 2 years. I moved from New York City to Florida. And so being a Florida resident, I feel comfortable using a pool metaphor here. And if you were to envision a pool, we've got just enough time today to take a quick dip in the pool of mindful leadership. This is an emerging field, and there are endless ways we could find ourselves in the deep end of the pool. So we'll be swimming in the part of the pool where we can comfortably stand, share insights, maybe even enjoy a beverage, virtually 6 feet apart, of course. And the first half of our webinar, we'll go over some background, talk about the benefits and the neuroscience. And the second half, we'll focus on real-world application, how you can benefit from mindful practices. And before moving on, it's worth noting here that mindfulness has gotten a ton of attention in press lately. It's hard to open up your laptop and not see something about it. Two things about that. While I'm happy to see a surge of new research, plus endorsements from CEOs and big companies, I admit I'm both excited and a bit leery by the attention mindfulness is getting. There's a potential risk, I feel, of overexposure or misrepresentation. So my message is that we should resist seeing this as a trend or the flavor of the month, but instead a shift in the way that we interact with the world and each other, a sustainable way for us to be more resilient and grounded so we can meet the challenges of our modern times. All right, so for those that know me, I love visuals, stories, and metaphors, so I'm going to start here with all three. This picture reminds me of my dad for a couple of reasons. My dad was an engineer and an amateur car mechanic, emphasis on the word amateur. And he used to love going to car shows like this one. Vintage cars, classics, sports cars, he loved them all. And when I was young, sometimes I'd go with him and we'd walk around looking at the cars. Now, I remember most people would comment on the exterior of the car. What a beautiful paint job, nice detail, or I like that car better than this car. But my dad would seek out and talk to the owners of these cars. All he wanted to do was talk about the engine. And as you can imagine, as a kid, this got old after a while. I had zero interest in talking about engines, and I just wanted to go explore. But as karma would have it, I absolutely learned my lesson the hard way a few times, that I should pay more attention to my engine, particularly when I broke down on the New Jersey Turnpike with, in the era before cell phones. So not fun. But getting back to my dad, being a good engineer, whenever he was faced with a problem or a challenge, his go-to phrase was, let's take a look under the hood and see what the issue is. And this phrase, let's take a look under the hood, has stuck with me over the years. It's a common phrase, but over time I seem to find meaning in it in more and more places. The work I do, for example. I work with leaders and organizations, and the truth is, many of them are really stressed, overwhelmed by work and home responsibilities, and sadly, many neglect their physical, mental, and emotional health. They're not taking care of what's under the hood. Cheryl pointed to a stress study that came out in 2019. 45% of leaders reported feeling stress as the predominant emotion at work. It's been my experience, at least, and maybe you agree, that part of what is contributing to this stress is that in our society, we've become conditioned and rewarded to place value and attention on everything happening outside the car. Other people's judgments, opinions, expectations, our multiple electronic devices. Everything in life we've got no control over, and it turns out to be a lot. So in many ways, mindfulness is about making a shift from being caught up or distracted by what's going on externally, and instead choosing to take care of and honoring what's under the hood and making that a priority, because it's really our engines that drive performance. So I took kind of the scenic route there. Thanks for taking the trip with me. And I think Peter Drucker does a nice job of summing this all up. You cannot manage other people unless you manage yourself first. And especially in these uncertain times, we literally and figuratively can't save others until we put our own mask on first. So whether you lead a virtual team, if you're leading your family, or maybe you're just tolerating your family right now, like some of us, I would argue that people have never been more in need of steady, calm, compassionate leadership than they are today. So we're going to pause here and just take a quick poll. I'm curious, for those on the call today, what's your current level of familiarity with mindfulness and meditation? And Justin, if you could pull up the poll, and then we'll see for how many of it is brand new, how many are familiar, somewhat familiar. Great. Great. And Justin, I think that we could end the poll now and show the results. Just out of curiosity, we can see for those calling in, what's our level of familiarity.
The results are being broadcast now.
Great. Great. So we have a mix here. We've got people that are a few people that are brand new, some somewhat familiar, and down the line. Great. All right. And my approach is that whatever practices that I present to people with mindfulness, it can help at any level. All right, so let's go ahead and end that poll. Thank you. And let's zoom out here a bit and highlight a few definitions. You may have heard of John Kabat-Zinn. He was the founder of MBSR, or mindfulness-based stress reduction. And his definition is mindfulness is the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally, to things as they are. So to expand on this, mindfulness is training our minds and bodies to come back to the present moment over and over. And it's building self-awareness of our triggers, noticing when we get caught up in stories or thoughts. Some may know the term monkey mind. Noticing when we are operating from autopilot. All of this helps us to do two things: be less reactive and respond more skillfully to the challenges in our lives. And one noteworthy thing here, and we'll touch on this again later, is that mindfulness has a compassion component. It's not just about bringing ourselves back to the present moment. It's the way in which we do that, gently, with compassion, not in a harsh, judgmental, or competitive way. And for many people, that is one of the hardest parts, especially in the United States. I always joke that if the United States could have a competition for best mindfulness meditator, I promise you people would sign up. So quick story here about a leader who took a mindful approach to a challenge. I was working with a director level leader, and he recently got some survey feedback from his team. The gist of it was his team felt like he was micromanaging their every move. And at first he seemed surprised at this feedback. But when he began to look at his career more objectively and took the judgment out of his reaction, he realized that this was a pattern. And for years in different jobs, he'd taken on a lot of his team's work because he was afraid they'd make mistakes or that it would reflect poorly on him. But until he created a little bit of space for himself to reflect, see the situation for what it was, his autopilot tendencies had been running the show. And maybe you can relate to that as well. So, if mindfulness is about bringing ourselves to the present moment, mindful leadership is about applying mindfulness to how we lead ourselves and others. There are a number of definitions out there, and I've decided that this is my favorite to date. A mindful leader embodies leadership presence by cultivating focus, creativity, clarity, and compassion in the service of others. And I'm going to hone in on a few words here. And the underlining theme in most definitions I've seen is the word presence shows up. Think of someone in your life who you feel truly embodies leadership presence. How do they act? What do they do? Presence is kind of an abstract term, but it's something that we can feel and sense, but it can be hard to put into words. For example, we know on a deep level when someone is present with us, when they're calm and centered, and when they're listening with an open mind and an open heart. And we can absolutely sense when they're not. And when a leader is not present, they may be physically there, but they're not really connecting with us, and they're not getting the best out of their team. So why does presence matter? Well, we know from Gallup that 70% of employees leave their jobs because of the manager, not the company. Presence can help us strengthen relationships and have a huge impact on the team's success. And the good news is that presence is a learnable skill. All right. So when we talk about workplace mindfulness, it's important to note what it is and also what it's not. So first, I wish this weren't true, but there is no immediacy to mindfulness. There's no one and done, poof, stress disappears. The magic is in the continual practice and commitment to doing a little bit each day. 2, while it's true that mindfulness has its roots in Buddhism, what we're talking about here is an adaptation. Mindful workplace practices are intended to be secular and inclusive, meaning if you are a human, you can benefit from them. And they are based in scientific research versus spirituality. And the last, it's a myth that mindfulness is a way to feel relaxed. Check out or escape reality. And as I joked with a colleague recently, this is no excuse to hide in your office and zone out. Not a good career move. All right, so let's take a look at the neuroscience. Mindfulness is a way to train the mind to attain what's called optimum states. An optimum state is kind of like a state of relaxed alertness. And if you can think of times when you felt, and operated at your best, when you felt most at ease, focused, creative, you were most likely in an optimum state. Before I go on, let's pull up our second poll. Justin, if you'd help me with that. And let's see who knows the answer to this question. All right, so in a 2014 Harvard study, those who practiced mindfulness regularly for 8 weeks, they saw certain changes in the brain. Which of these are true? There's only one right answer. Good. All right, we're getting some different responses here. All right. All right, let's wrap this poll up. And for those that are curious, if you chose the third answer, you were correct. Increased activity in the hippocampus, decreased activity in the amygdala, increased access to the prefrontal cortex. So if you chose that one, you are right on the money. All right. Great. So let's wrap up our poll. Wonderful. Okay. So again, these were the changes that from fMRI scans that they noticed with people who did mindfulness meditation for an 8-week trial. The hippocampus, this is the part of the brain responsible for learning, memory, emotional regulation, and also spatial orientation. There was an interesting study done with London cab drivers about 10 years ago. They did brain scans and found that their hippocampus to be larger than bus drivers. Since the bus drivers typically had the same route each day, while the cab drivers, they had to learn the entire city and create a mental map of all the streets. So you've got increased activity in the hippocampus, decreased activity in the amygdala, and for those that are familiar, that's the part of our brain responsible for triggering the fight or flight response as a reaction to threat. Whether that threat is real or perceived, the brain treats it the same. And when the amygdala is overactive, it secretes the stress hormones adrenaline and cortisol, and that's why we feel anxious and it's hard to think clearly. So if you've ever experienced what's called an amygdala hijack, I think we can all agree that that's not an optimum state. And last, practicing mindfulness can literally help us access the prefrontal cortex, and that is the logical decision-making part of your brain. And you can probably see how this translates to a leader in an organization. The more quickly you can shift out of fight or flight, the less reactive you tend to be, the better able to focus, think clearly, and make better decisions. All right. So we're in exciting times right now. There's a wave of scientific research backing the efficacy of mindfulness. And here's just a quick summation of the proven benefits. Great list, right? Like who wouldn't want these benefits? Maybe you've experienced some of these for yourself. And the question here is, how does practicing mindfulness translate to day-to-day leadership? What does it actually help leaders do so they're more effective? And here are 3 examples of companies that had opt-in voluntary mindfulness programs, and I picked these 3 because they had some great data to support the ROI. So, and also I'm just curious, as I'm describing a little bit about these companies, if you've ever experienced a mindfulness program in your own company, if you had anything in your own company, that would be really interesting. If you could add that to the chat, please do. So getting back to the slide, I'm not going to read this slide, but what is interesting here is that you'll see that these companies were not measuring the same things. In some cases, stress reduction was important to measure, and in other cases, innovation, focus, or productivity were what were most important. They didn't just start a mindfulness program because it was trendy or a nice thing to do. They tailored their programs to address immediate business needs. One example is Pacific Blue Cross, the one on top. Wendy Kwan started the mindfulness program there about 10 years ago, and she's got a great white paper I could share that show the benefits of mindfulness coupled with change management. Her work helps people cope with the stress and uncertainty of a multi-year company-wide change that impacted everybody. All right, so you may be asking yourself at this point, well, what do mindful leaders actually do? So there's no exact formula for becoming a mindful leader, but there are specific things that we can do day to day. Mindful practices are typically at the intersection of these 2 activities, mindfulness and meditation. So if mindfulness is the practice of being present and in the now, of developing that moment-to-moment non-judgmental awareness, meditation is about setting aside time in your day to focus in a more formal way. Typically, we have an object of focus like the breath, or it could be something that you repeat, like a mantra. Some leaders may do simple mindfulness exercises like taking 3 quick breaths before answering your email to make sure that you're centered and grounded before you start firing off emails, or noticing intentionally the sounds and colors when you're out walking. And other leaders may lean towards more formal meditation that they do before or after work. The point being, mindful leadership practices typically include a blend of both, and the 6 practices you'll see next are organized into themes. These are the practices that I found to be the most accessible and relevant for busy leaders. So even if my clients are not new to mindfulness, I recommend these as foundational. And the reason that some are highlighted, in the interest of time, I'm going to zoom in on 4 of the 6. I feel like many of us probably know our stress triggers the past 2 months, and the monotasking and multitasking we could always talk about on a separate call. But excuse me. And I also have a handout that describes each of these at the end in case you're looking for more of a summary. But the intention behind these practices are twofold: to help us first regulate the central nervous system so we can create the right internal conditions, and 2, create space between stimulus and response so we can respond more skillfully versus react from autopilot or a place of anxiety or fear. What's nice about these practices is they don't add more work to your day. They ask you to see your world differently and interact with it differently. So at first glance, they may seem simple, but I find that these practices are like putting money into a high yield bank account a little at a time, and the benefits will compound over time. All right. If you pick up only one practice from today, this is the one. Mindful breathing is your main anchor and the starting point to all others. This practice can be informal or formal, meaning you can plan for it or not. And mindful breathing just a few times a day can help us regulate our nervous systems. It's kind of like hitting the reset button on our stress response. And if you're like most busy leaders, it can be a little shocking to feel what it's like to actually breathe more deeply. And when you start paying attention, you might be surprised how much of your day is spent taking really short breaths. And when we do that, it signals the brain there's some kind of threat, and that stimulates our fight or flight response. And the result is we end up feeling more anxious. So breathing more deeply, even if for just a few times a day, helps to mitigate that. By activating the parasympathetic, that one's a hard one to say, nervous system, this type of breathing can help us relax and reset. So our best friend here is the purposeful pause. And I give credit here to Janice Martirano. She's the founder of the Institute for Mindful Leadership. The purposeful pause can be informal or formal. You can do this anywhere, anytime, just 30 seconds to a minute. And it's especially effective if we're emotionally triggered or we're about to go into a situation or a meeting where we think we'll be triggered. So let's try this together. Whoever's game for this, please do this with me. And for the next minute, wherever you are right now, just settle in. And for this exercise, sit up straight but relaxed. And you can keep your eyes open. Start to relax and soften the muscles in your face, jaw, shoulders. Breathe a bit more deeply than normal, but not so it feels unnatural. And as thoughts surface, and they will, just acknowledge them and visualize letting them go. And when you notice yourself getting distracted, gently bring yourself back to the breath. That's it. And if we had more time, we would move on to the second bullet, mindful breathing. It is just an extension of the purposeful pause. So I'm curious. One of the things I hear most from people who are, especially people who are just starting out, is that I have a hard time just observing my thoughts or letting them go. And if that is you, feel free to put a yes in the chat box. If you have a tough time just observing your thoughts or letting them go. Yeah, I hear that a lot. And for those that find it hard to let go of thoughts, I have 2 visuals which you might find helpful. The first one, when doing this practice, I sometimes think of a house. I'm inside the house. The front door and the back door are open. Thoughts are free to come and go, but I don't invite them to sit down for tea. Eventually, they get bored and they either leave through the front or the back door. Another visual that might be helpful, and this one also helps in cultivating non-judgment and self-compassion, which, quieting that inner voice that is harsh or self-critical, telling you that you're doing all this wrong. So this visual involves puppies. I'm a dog person, so this visual works for me. If you were to imagine a litter of puppies all gathered in a pen, and a few curious puppies, they keep trying to escape the pen. Now, in this case, you wouldn't react out of anger or impatience. They're just puppies. They can't help themselves. And you gently and lovingly pick up each puppy and place it safely back in the pen. And this is what we should do with mindful breathing. We don't judge our thoughts or get overly critical. We gently and compassionately bring ourselves back to the breath over and over. So just something to note here. The two examples on this slide are like an entry or a doorway to a longer meditation practice. They're incredibly effective on their own, however. But for many people who are not accustomed to meditation, or maybe they're used to going 100 miles per hour each day, they're chronically busy, or maybe they've experienced some kind of trauma, sitting still and just breathing can feel dysregulating. So my recommendation is always to start small and then build as you feel comfortable. All right. Our second practice that we'll look at today, trust the body. So there are a lot of reminders out there to get enough physical exercise during this quarantine, and yes, it's absolutely important. This practice, however, goes beyond just getting a good workout. It's all about trusting the body to first give us vital information, and then purposely using the body to help us be more present and regulate moods and emotions. There's a lot of exciting research around what's called somatic intelligence, and I have a few resources in my handout. That all day, every day, the brain sends signals to the body, and the body sends signals to the brain. One influences the other. So first, let's just do a quick exercise that shows how connected our bodies and minds are. And not to torture anybody, but I'd like you to think of an experience where you felt really embarrassed. Maybe you said or did something and then you instantly regretted it. Where do you feel that in your body? And if you're open to sharing, please add that to the chat. Where do you feel that? Heat in the face, pit in my stomach, yeah. I have a memory of hitting reply all and my face and neck clenching. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. For every emotion, we have thoughts about it, and then there's a corresponding somatic or body experience. And on a day-to-day basis, some of these sensations are easy to ignore, however. And I'm just going to share a quick story of what happens when you don't pay attention to your body's signals. About 15 years ago, I was working full-time with a capital F, taking classes, managing student loans, and then my mom got really sick. And at the time, I really wasn't practicing mindfulness. So when I think back, it may have seemed on the outside that I was holding it all together, but in reality, I let stress have the upper hand. I kept soldiering on, though, and completely ignored the signals my body was sending me. Headaches, stomach pain, exhaustion, anxiety. And the signals got louder and louder, and I tried to override them with my mind. I said things like, I'm fine, I can power through, it'll be fine. Well, the truth is I wasn't fine, and I was really close to burnout. And I remember running my hands through my hair one day, and a few clumps just came out in my fingers. And if that wasn't my wake-up call to listen to my body, I'm not sure what would be. But gladly, I've made a lot of changes since that time, and I'm very grateful. Maybe you can relate to that story. I'm hoping you can't relate to it, but maybe some of you can. All right, so it's too late for a spoiler alert, but the body does not lie. A few tips here for tapping into the wisdom of the body. It's first about listening and paying attention to the sensations. of our body. And when we notice what's happening, when we notice what's happening, especially if we're triggered, we are instantly in the present moment. Just simple noticing a few times a day can help us get out of our head and be more present. I read an article recently by a woman who experienced burnout, and it revealed how disconnected our bodies and minds have become for so many workers today. She was in IT and spent most of her day at the computer, and she said, "I'm in my head so much, I feel like I'm a brain on a stick." And if you've ever felt like your body is just something to take you from meeting to meeting, maybe you can relate to that. And the third point here, use movement and posture to help you self-regulate moods and emotions. Now, if you've ever tried to think your way out of a bad mood or an anxious state, you know how hard that can be. It's sort of like telling somebody to calm down. It typically doesn't work. People are not going to calm down if you tell them to. So our bodies, however, have natural tendencies which contribute to feelings of well-being, and that can help us feel more calm and balanced. And I'm going to leave you today with just one somatic tip that can help improve mood and focus. It's easy. Pay attention during the day to your posture. And when you notice your back slumping, adjust to a more open, upright posture and breathe. And this is a great remedy for what some have called the iPhone hunch. Maybe you've heard of it. You may be able to picture it too. It's when our spines and our heads curve over our devices, and many of us spend countless hours, and it's like a semi-collapsed shape. How often do you find yourself in that position? And the truth is we all do it. But extended time in that posture, it hinders our ability to breathe deeply, and on a primal level, our body interprets this as a protective posture and sends signals to the brain of possible threat. The body responds by releasing stress hormones, and everything in this posture can feel more intense: fear, anxiety, overwhelm. But when we shift to a more open, upright posture and breathe, this signals to the brain that we're okay. And it also signals to those around us that we are present, confident, and receptive. And so the main takeaways here: notice how your body responds, listen to what it's telling you, and when you start to feel stressed, anxious, or overwhelmed, get out of your head and trust your body to help you self-regulate. All right, our third practice, building the habit of questioning your thoughts. So I like to say that the body is that friend in our life who's been by our side forever, the person that we can count on to be totally honest when no one else is. Our thoughts, on the other hand, are more like unreliable acquaintances. We like them sometimes, but they have a history of saying some sketchy or untrue things. We can't trust them completely. So as humans, our default mode prompts us all to some degree ruminate about the past, worry about the future, and distract ourselves in the present moment. And as we get lost in thought, these stories can stir up powerful emotions. And if those stories and thoughts are negative or disempowering, it's easy to spiral into fear, worry, judgment. So quick story here to illustrate how our thoughts can lead us astray. I worked with a leader last year, and there had been a number of layoffs in her company, and she started to fear that she was next. And over time, all of her thoughts started to rally around and try to confirm this fear. For example, when her boss didn't respond promptly, she thought she was getting sidelined. And when she was called into any executive's office, she thought, well, that's it, I must be done. Long story short, she's still with the company, and she is feeling better now, in large part because she really started to see how much of a grip her thoughts had over her, and also how much unnecessary suffering she was causing herself. So we can't stop the process of thinking, but we can make it work for us versus against us. Building awareness of our thoughts is the first step to reframing them. And the tip here, as you go about your day, pay attention to your thoughts, and when you notice a particular thought, judgment, or story begin to loop, that's your cue to say, wait, what am I thinking? The next step, ask yourself, are these thoughts helpful or harmful? And that's the first question. But as you develop this practice, there are follow-up questions you can ask yourself. Things like, are these thoughts true? What's the story I keep telling myself here? What's another way to look at this situation? What would be a more empowering thought? So the takeaway here is remember that our thoughts come and go like the weather, and they are not always true. And the power we give them is completely up to us. And the more we practice mindfulness, the easier it becomes to acknowledge our thoughts, but at a distance, as opposed to getting swept up by them. So to further this, let's look at how mindfulness shines a light on perception versus reality. By noticing and acknowledging how things really are in the present moment, what's noted in the bottom box, as opposed to how we would like them to be or how we think they should be, what's in the top box. Mindfulness can help us really clearly see our perceptions versus reality, and so we can more skillfully respond to challenges. It's when we find ourselves in this yellow highlighted area, the gap, that's where suffering and frustration live. So a work example might be an employee has been underperforming lately, and in our mind, we have thoughts and expectations of how we'd like things to be, how we'd like this employee to be performing, but that's not the reality. We've ignored the situation for weeks now and resist dealing with it. We find ourselves in the gap. Our frustration just gets worse until we choose to acknowledge what is and find a skillful, compassionate way to have that tough conversation that we need to have. All right, so I've found this concept to be very helpful both at work and at home. So my mom is a perfect example, and just know my mom has given me full permission to use her stories. So I've been helping out my mom this year, and I'm helping her move out of her single family house into a smaller, more maintenance-friendly home. She is a self-described collector of things. And I, on the other hand, might call her an organized hoarder. So now I would like if this wasn't the case, but that's not my current reality. I love my mom, and so I need to meet her where she is and create some space for myself before saying something I regret. So wish me luck. This will be a huge test of my mindfulness. And one more example. This is Gracie. She's our 3-year-old rescue dog, and we've had her for a year now. And she had a very rough start in life. And so for the first 6 months we had her, she was terrified of everything, and she had terrible separation anxiety. And after a while, my husband and I started to get really discouraged, and we just wanted her to be better. You know, we thought, okay, you're safe now. There's nothing to be afraid of. And we wanted to speed up the process. Well, once we realized that she was on her timetable, not ours, we were able to let go of expectations and just be with her in the present moment. And the good news is that after a year, she's made real progress, but in her time, not ours. Okay, so rounding out our highlights for today, in the last practice gratitude. And as I talk about this, if anyone wants to share something that you're particularly grateful for during this pandemic, we'd love to see that. So you may have heard the saying, energy flows where attention goes, or in other words, what we focus on tends to grow. Research confirms that when we shift our focus from what we see as wrong, and granted, there's a lot wrong out there, but instead pay attention to what's good in our lives by acknowledging what we're grateful for, we are literally rewiring our brains to be more resilient. So we can keep a gratitude journal. It's a great way to start or end the day, but just an informal practice where we make a habit of noticing and acknowledging things during our day that we're grateful for, no matter how small, can bring us psychological benefit. It's all about building the habit. All right, so as we come to a close here, I'd like to end today with a question. And if you're open to it, what's either one insight or takeaway you have, or maybe one way that these practices might be helpful for you during this crisis? I'll give you a second to slow down, breathe, think. Yeah. As you're writing this, I'll close by thanking you so much for joining today. I'm passionate about this topic, and I'm hoping it's ignited some curiosity for you. Again, we didn't go into the deep end of the pool, but it's okay. There's always time for that. And there'll be a handout that summarizes these practices. And also, if you are interested in learning about an 8-week online series that I provide, where we explore and discuss more about how mindful leadership can benefit you, my contact information is on the next slide. So with that, Justin, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Brenda, and thank you, Cheryl, for opening up for us. This has been a great webinar, and I know some of these tips and techniques I'll be able to apply here while working from home, and to be grateful for what we have. So I advanced the slide to have your contact information on here, Brenda, and in a moment, just a moment after you get Brenda's contact information, copy down so you can follow up with her if you have any additional questions or if you're interested in the opportunity that she mentioned. We're going to move to a feedback slide. If you could just give us a little bit of feedback on the audio quality, and you can provide potential future topics for these webinars. We're very thankful for the presenter, for Cheryl for introducing us, for the partnership with TrainingPros, and we're just thankful for the ability to put together these webinars with compelling and timely content like this one. So with that, I'm gonna sign off. I'm gonna move to the feedback slide. If you can provide your feedback, then please do. And outside of that, please stay safe and healthy and have a wonderful rest.